My name's Kian, this is Laura, and we are both AmeriCorps members serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. So for the people that are joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. So please type any questions you have into the chat or the Q&A, and we will have some time to answer those after the presentation or throughout, however you want to do it. And then for both in person and online, we will have a very brief survey following the presentation that shouldn't take longer than a minute to complete. And that survey just helps continue to support programming like this one. So we appreciate everybody taking the time to fill those out. And then I will turn it over to Laura to introduce tonight's speaker.
Tonight we have Dr. Jeremy White here, here to talk about conservation of bats. He is from Nevada and he got his bachelor's degree there and studied also at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where he became more interested in researching on bats. So we're excited to have him talk tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And we're a rabid crowd here tonight. I have to make sure keep them in line. We can't, so I'm aiming to talk for about 45 minutes, and then happy to address questions after that, if you guys are okay with that.
Yep.
And I think I'm gonna, can I stand just so I can click the slides forward? I didn't bring a little clicker here. So
Do you want me to sit here to look at questions, or do you want to just look at them throughout the presentation? It can be either way.
yeah, if you help me out with that,
Yeah,
that might be
yep,
great.
yeah,
Just so I don't miss any.
Yeah.
If some questions come in, that'd be great. I was talking to Laura about a title for this talk, and I wanted to talk about bat conservation. It's something I've done some work in, but I'm also really interested in. And then the movie Wicked came out, and I thought, well, this might be a good play on a title. But then I didn't know if there were actually bats in Wicked. I've seen the live version, and I don't remember any bats, but I Googled, as you do, right? Are there bats in Wicked? And this came up, which this was fun for me because this is a good friend of mine, Trish Freeman, from a retired professor from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And she, throughout her career, did a bunch of research on bats. And in 2018, they named a new species of bat that was found in Panama after her, called Freeman's dog-faced bat. So she got the ultimate recognition of the species named after her for all the work she did. And her response when they asked her about it, she said it was wicked cool that happened. So that's what came up when I typed in, are bats in the movie Wicked? So I still don't have an answer to that. Maybe someone does, and they can chime in about that. But the reason I mentioned Wicked is that in environmental biology or environmental management or sustainability, there's this phrase, wicked problems. And a wicked environmental problem is something that has no easy solution. It's a complex problem, and there's not a solution. It's an easy answer to it. So there are lots of what are considered wicked environmental problems. And one of them that we're currently going through is loss of biodiversity. So as many of you probably know, we're currently going through our 6th mass extinction, and there are many human-related causes that are contributing to this overall biodiversity loss on the globe. And the major ones are habitat destruction or fragmentation. So species need places to live, right? And as we continue to use up more of Earth's surface, a lot of it for agriculture, but also for mining, urban areas, we affect the diversity there and impact many species in those areas. Also, invasive species are a big problem globally, and we've seen the loss of species due specifically to that. Global changes, which that can have a lot to do with, or it can have to do with many things like climate change, but also pollution. And so these changes we're seeing based on humans and our use of the land, and then over harvesting too. So these are the main reasons we're seeing species decline. And as with many things, it being a wicked problem, it's complex, right? So you can imagine that species, and here's an example with amphibians, that it's not one reason, right? Habitat loss is a big one, but pollution, invasive species, disease like chytrid fungus, and many unknown causes are all kind of this perfect storm to create an environment where we're seeing a global decline in amphibians. So bats are also facing this. And so I'm going to focus in on bats, and mainly bats in North America, mainly bats around our area of Nebraska. But I want to just mention global threats to bats. And this has been a changing landscape. And so this picture, nice picture taken by Eric Fowler from Nebraska Land Magazine, is of a northern long-eared bat, which when I started doing work on bats in eastern Nebraska in this region about 15 years ago, the northern long-eared bat was one of the most common species we used to catch and see at Fontenelle Forest. So I take students there in class and we'd net bats, and this is mainly, we catch big brown bats and we catch a lot of northern long-eared bats. This species is now an endangered species due to white nose syndrome, which is a disease we'll talk about in a minute. But Eric Fowler set up this camera trap where these species were roosting, or these bats, there was a maternity colony roosting in this tiny little crack they could access above this is a Girl Scout camp, Camp Catron in Nebraska City, right outside of Nebraska City. So there were Girl Scouts in these little cabins, and there was this maternity colony of bats roosting above them. And they didn't know, they'd leave at night, fly around, eat insects, come back, feed their pups, their young ones that were in there. So it was a group of mothers and their pups that were roosting here. And typically when I get a call to check out a human space, like an attic or something for bats, it's almost always big brown bats. But in this case, it was these northern long-eared bats. But so I've seen this species decline in the past 15 years since I've been working at it. And I actually haven't seen or caught an individual of this species in the past 5 years here. So these, thinking more globally with bats, a paper came out 10 years or so ago that looked at the major causes of decline in bats. And this is divided into before 2000 and after 2000. So before 2000 being the gray, and then after 2000, the black. And worldwide, before 2000, the major reason we saw losses of bats was intentionally killing them for various reasons, or either a fear of disease or competing with farmers for fruits or other crops. And then, other reasons contributed as well, but that was the big one. And interesting, you see here disease, bats, and some of you might have heard about this recently. Bats carry a lot of diseases that don't really impact bats that much. They've got a really effective immune system. In fact, bats hardly ever get cancer either. So recently there was a paper that came out that said bats are the healthiest animals in the world in terms of their low incidence of disease and things like cancer. But since 2000, we've had a big shift. And the two main causes far and away are wind turbines and white nose syndrome, which are really specific causes, but they contribute to both. Wind turbines can be grouped in with habitat changes, and white nose syndrome is actually here in North America an invasive species. It's an invasive disease that's impacting bats, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to focus on these two and then talk about a little bit of the research we've done and potential solutions possibly for these causes of mortality in bats. So wind turbines and white nose syndrome. We'll start with white nose syndrome. So this, you can see on this little group of bats that's roosting in a hibernaculum, this growth of this white fungal growth on their noses, also their wings. So this is a fungus that's pretty closely related to other species that live in cave environments that are actually decomposers. But the difference with this fungus is it will grow on live animals, and it will grow throughout their wing tissue and their ears and their muzzles. And it impacts them by causing them to arouse more often in their cave environment, which is a bad thing for bats because their temperature goes down and their metabolism goes down, and they survive all winter on this stored energy. their fat reserves. And when they have this fungus, they're arousing more often, and then they start to get dehydrated. Their blood chemistry changes too, and then they start using up all these fat reserves. And so bats are often dying. The ultimate cause, or the cause, is starvation, but it's because of this fungus that's impacted them. But this was brand new to North America, at least in 2006, is when they first started seeing bats outside of a cave in New York State that were dying in large numbers, and they had this white fungal growth on them. And they didn't know if that was the cause of the disease at first or not. And then they started to see this spread, and then a lot of research was done to figure out, yes, this is actually what's causing these bats to die. And we've learned a lot more about it since then, but it's spread really rapidly. So this was a map of 2010. It started here where the circle is, and it spread both north and south down the Appalachians. And those of you that know some of these areas know there are a lot of caves in these systems, and it was really impacting bats that hibernate. And then here's a map from 2018 where it spread all the way to the Great Plains. We saw it in Nebraska, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then it jumped all the way to Washington. And now this is one of the latest maps, which shows it's now confirmed in 40 states, the disease and the fungus in many more than that. So there are only a few states here, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, and Hawaii, I guess, that don't have this fungus there. And in Nebraska, so this is a map, don't really pay attention to the black circles here and the blue ones, but I want to draw your attention to these big circles. We, in 2014, with Game and Parks and some colleagues at Kearney, Keith Geluso, and also Trish Freeman and Cliff Lemon at Lincoln, we started sampling some underground hibernacula for the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. And we only had access to 2 sites. Those of you guys that are familiar with Nebraska know there aren't caves out there. We don't see many caves. There are some mines in this area, mining things like limestone and sandstone. And then there's a tourist mine called Happy Jack Chalk Mine, which some of you might be familiar with, that's out here in Greeley County. But other than that, there aren't a lot of hibernacula for bats that we knew about, at least. So we tested these sites in 2014 for the fungus, and we didn't see it. But what we did is, here's an entrance to one of the mines that's just south of Omaha. And there's a little opening there, but this is also a mine that Game and Parks has worked with to install a bat gate to keep people out, or a gate, and then the bats can still enter and exit this and use it as a hibernaculum, but people can't enter, except if you find this hole, I guess you can, because there is another entrance there. But this is what it looks like inside. It opens up quite large, and we would look for bats in these mines. And here you see, this is Mike Fritz, who used to work at Game and Parks, looking on the ceiling, and occasionally we'd find bats roosting in there, but not many. But then we started to look closer, and you see little cracks here, 2 little northern long-eared bats that are hiding in a little crack. So it was pretty hard to see them. So we realized we also had to net the entrances to them. And so we'd go through and do a survey, but then we'd also put nets out in spring, late or early spring. And as bats started to emerge to go feed on insects, we could catch them in these nets. And here's Cliff Lemon pulling a bat out of a net. And so we would inspect the bats and look at them. And so here's the wing of a bat. Actually, this is a young bat. This was taken in summer, not at that time, because you can see little cartilage. The wing hasn't totally ossified, and that's how we can tell something about the age of a bat. But this is a healthy looking wing. You can see their bones and some little blood vessels. But one thing that's interesting that they discovered about this fungus, it's not unlike ringworm in that it will fluoresce orange if you shine an ultraviolet light on it. So here we would shine ultraviolet light, and here's a bat. All these little orange dots are the fungus that's growing throughout this wing tissue. And even when bats look totally healthy, like this big brown bat, we take a swab. So the wings look good, no white growth on them. The ultraviolet light didn't show anything. but we take a little swab of the rostrum, and then we could send that off for DNA analysis to see if the fungus was present. So since we've learned more about this disease, what we understand is it affects hibernating bats, and by the method I talked about earlier, and there are mainly 3 species that are really impacted by this. One is the tricolored bat, another is the little brown bat, and then the northern long-eared bat, which I talked about. So this bat has lost, some estimates, but all of these, in some areas, over 90% of the population has been lost due to white nose syndrome. And so this bat has been listed as endangered for that reason, and this bat is currently going through that process of potentially being listed. And so when in 2014, none of the bats that we tested were positive for the fungus. They all looked healthy and good. In 2015, we went back and we found that the fungus was present. The bats looked healthy, but when we ran the DNA analysis, sent those off, it came back positive. So these bats in eastern Nebraska, the fungus seemed to be here, which went along with the progression of the disease moving east to west in these hibernating bats. This site here was negative in Happy Jack chalk mine. So just to go ahead, we started to get access to more mines. There was another mine near here that we got access to in 2016, and that turned positive. It was only a mile away from this other mine, so that wasn't surprising. And then we started testing Robbers Cave in Lincoln, Nebraska. That was negative at that time. Oh, I went ahead too far. Hold on. Oh, I guess I changed my slides a little bit. Okay, sorry. So that ended up going positive too in the next year in 2017. And then we actually saw evidence of bats dying of white nose syndrome. So sometimes they can carry the fungus and you don't see mass mortality from them, but we were allowed to go into a bigger mine that had a pretty big colony. One of the mining corporations let us in, and there we saw dead bats on the ground. We had some tested for white nose syndrome and it was positive. So we saw with our own eyes that bats were dying here of the disease and had it confirmed. So one of the things we want to do is we didn't really understand where all these bats were hibernating in winter. And so we started to think about how we could figure out where more bats are spending the winter. And we know that we have this method, acoustics, and using acoustic detectors. And these are simply putting out ultrasonic microphones that can record very high frequency calls. And we know when bats are flying around, they're echolocating, right? They're making these high frequency calls and they're listening for those echoes that are coming back. And we know different bats make different types of sounds. So this is a hoary bat, which is a pretty large species of bat. And here's a spectrogram of the sounds it makes. And these sounds are all high frequency. They're above what we can hear, but they make, oh, thanks.
Sorry, there's a thing that came up.
Oh, thanks. They make lower frequency calls than this small northern long-eared bat, which makes these high frequency calls. And you can see there's different shape. So we can tell different species based on the calls they make. And we can also determine, hey, if they're active or not, right? And so we thought, let's test this at this mine and see, are bats leaving the mine in winter or early spring? And so here's a little graph showing, even in the dead of winter, you see these little blips. So there are bats that are coming out and calling. So they're flying around, which isn't that unusual. We know bats will wake up occasionally and fly around, and that allows them to get their metabolism going and their immune system going. But there's not much activity. And then when we start to hit March and into spring, we see quite a bit more activity. So we thought maybe we can use this method to find if there are other hibernacula around Nebraska. So here are some students from UNO, and we were tromping around in late fall and in winter, putting out these acoustic detectors. And so we'd put them at the base of these rocky cliffs, and this is at Ponca, actually, State Park, along the Missouri River. And we'd let them go for the winter and see if we recorded any calls. And when we did that, we did it along the Niobrara River and also along the Missouri River where there was exposed rock, thinking these bats might be roosting in rocky cliffs and rocky areas. And all the yellow dots show areas where we got calls of northern long-eared bats. And so, you know, when we went into this, we were thinking maybe all the bats, you know, are flying to these caves that are, or these mines that are down in this area, or maybe they are, you know, they're roosting in these rocky cliffs. But having acoustic evidence of them flying around doesn't really tell us exactly where they're hibernating, and we don't know where those sites are. So this was one of those projects that took a whole lot of time and effort, and we had a lot of failures with it because we thought, well, how can we follow up on this? You know, we think they're there, but we don't know for sure. So we went out with these infrared cameras that will pick up on heat signatures of animals. And we thought this should work in winter when everything's cold out there. And if there's a little bat flying around that comes out of a rock crevice, it should be warm and it should light up. We should be able to see it. And so we set them at the base of these cliffy areas where we saw activity based on acoustics. And we thought bats might be hibernating. Here's a little video. Let's see if this works. If you look at this spot right here, this is a big crack near at Ponca State Park in a limestone cliff. And there a little bat came out. So here with the video, we were able to tell that at this site, bats were actually using that particular cliff. And then here it is during the day, there's a pretty big opening there, big enough for a raccoon to fit in. Actually, we saw a raccoon go in there one time. And we put our mist nets up just to confirm, because based on acoustics, it can be difficult to tell some of these species apart. And we had that bat flying out of it. And so we actually set up our nets and we caught 5 northern long-eared bats coming out of that. And so we determined, yeah, and this was actually the first evidence that these bats will roost in, they will use cliffs and rocky crevices as hibernacula. But it makes sense because earlier I showed you that they would pack in these little cracks in the caves themselves or the mines themselves. So they were doing that in the rock face as well. The bad news with this was that we tested those bats we caught for white nose or for the fungus. And we thought, you know, maybe if these bats are using these cliffs and they're real spread out, it might slow the spread of the disease. Maybe there are some cracks that only hold a few bats, and maybe they won't mix with other bats, and so they won't get the fungus. And so if bats are really concentrated in winter on the landscape in very few spots, they can easily spread that disease. If they're more spread out, we thought maybe they won't spread it, or maybe the microclimate's different in these little cracks and the fungus can't grow in those sites. It turns out that wasn't the case. And these bats were all 5 of them were positive for the fungus. And then we had another site, Robbers Cave, which I talked about earlier, which went positive too. Then we continued testing in Niobrara, thinking maybe we could find bats in cliffs up there. And actually this was done by the University of Wyoming, was going out there and testing in the Great Plains for more sites where this fungus might spread to. And in 21, they went back there and this tested positive for the fungus as well. So it seems that bats that might use those rocky crevices weren't protected at all from spreading the fungus. However, the good news on this is that even though we didn't find little remnant populations that weren't exposed to the fungus, they have in some areas. So this is an area in Pennsylvania where they found northern long-eared bats roosting in little rock crevices, and they haven't seemed to be as yet impacted by white nose syndrome. So there might be some populations out there that haven't been impacted yet. And one thing and you can see by looking on this map, the states I mentioned before where this hasn't been found, another state where we haven't seen it is actually Florida. And if you look all along the coast, there are no positive sites. So it seems like coastal areas aren't being impacted by this yet and might be little reservoirs of safety for some of these species. And they found This is one of the areas where they're finding northern long-eared bats is on the coast. So bit of a silver lining there, maybe. Okay, I can keep going and then do questions at the end. We think, are there any questions out there? Have you seen any?
Arizona hasn't popped up.
And that's such a worry, is those southwestern states, the huge colonies they have down there, the species diversity they have down there. And so it has popped up in New Mexico, but yeah, as of yet, not Arizona. So, and we'll continue, to look at that and monitor. But yeah, so far, if we go back to what you're asking about, Glenn, yeah, Arizona hasn't popped up yet. Carlsbad, yep, is down in this area, yep. And so I don't know specifically the situation there, but it looks like red is the most recent year, 2023, 2024. So I'll have to look into that to see, but yeah, like that's where, in Texas too, you have the big colonies of Mexican free-tailed bats. But along with saying, I didn't mention this, the 3 species we see heavily impacted. There are other species that are also impacted, but we also see some species that aren't as impacted. Like big brown bats seem to be able to tolerate it okay. There's not a lot of mortality. Some other species, there's not as much mortality either. So turning to this for a minute. So the other big cause of mortality was kind of a surprise too, in that in the early 2000s, when more wind turbines at least started to go up in North America, they were doing some surveys to look for dead birds, thinking, there might be bird collisions and we might see these structures killing various species of raptors and other birds. And the result of that was some dead birds, but also dead bats. And I don't think that was expected to see, and the numbers kept piling up of more and more bats at the base of these wind turbines. And so they've done some estimates, and it's a pretty significant number. And here's a map just showing, and this is 5 years ago or so, showing the number of installed wind turbines. And we see a lot of this in the Northeast, but also, as you guys know here, it's a very windy area. There's a lot of potential for wind power and development of these wind turbines. And so we have a large number of wind turbines in the Great Plains. And so this is one of those things, going back to the wicked, problem. Energy use is another one. This is one solution, having a renewable energy source, but it also has some impacts, right? It's not a perfect solution. And one of those impacts is a danger to wildlife. And we've seen more and more wind farms going up in Nebraska as well. This shows the colors, the wind speeds. And you see a lot of the wind farms are in this region of Nebraska, but there are also some going up out west as well. And so in the past 20 years or so, they've tried to figure out, why are bats attracted to them, try to understand more which species are being impacted by these wind turbines. And it's been determined, I think, that there's a change in the pressure happening where there can be some impact to the lungs of these species with that getting in that rotor swept zone, but there are also collisions, and they have videos of collisions and showing them actually hitting the blades and dying as a result of that. So figured out some of this mortality, and some estimates have been done that this is a big deal. Like for certain species, it could actually be a really important factor in declines of the species. So this is a hoary bat, and this is the species that in North America that's most impacted by wind turbines. We've seen the most fatalities from them. And it seems to be significant, where with the amount of wind turbines we have now, we'd see big declines in the species. And of course, they're projected to have even more turbines on the landscape. So this might be hard to see, but just to point out what they started to realize in the early days of the fatalities is it was mainly 3 species: hoary bats, eastern red bats, and silver-haired bats. So they made up about just over 70% of mortalities. And what we know about these species, so here's a silver-haired bat, and if you look at the ranges of them, they're found in a large portion of North America. Eastern red bats are mainly in the eastern half, but throughout Nebraska, and then hoary bats. And so what we know about these species is they're migrating species. They're tree roosters, where they're typically roosting in trees, the leaves of trees, and then they migrate. So they take big migrations. They spend summers in northern parts or higher elevation areas, and then they'll migrate south. And hoary bats have been even known to fly to South America. They've colonized the Hawaiian Islands. They've been found at ships at sea. So they'll take long migratory flights. But they've also found that this is happening in late summer, early fall. And that's the time when these bats are migrating south, but they're also getting together for reproduction. So that's when these bats are swarming and they're reproducing. And so a difference maybe with birds and bats is that when birds seem to fly by wind turbines, bats fly to them. So there seems to be some sort of attraction where they think they might be coming together around these structures in order to feed and to breed in late summer and early fall. And that's where a lot of the fatalities happen. And it seems like an odd thing to do, but if you think about bats, they evolved on this landscape without tall buildings, without wind turbines, without these structures. So as tree roosting bats, they think they would come together around tall structures in the environment, like tall trees. And so that's one idea for them, and the number of mortalities they've had. So Glenn's here, and he's involved in this project I'm going to talk about in a second, but I wanted to kind of turn this because I realized with conservation, biology, we're thinking about reducing this loss of biodiversity, right? Helping these species in some way. But part of that is understanding the problem. What is the problem and what do we need to try and fix, and what are the solutions? But this was interesting. I found this paper years ago that looked at publications, and it was in these different types of problems: habitat fragmentation, overexploitation, right? Invasive species, pollution. And the black shows papers that focused on the solutions, testing different solutions for the problem, and the gray are focusing on the problem. And so our research has heavily been into the problem, right? And not necessarily what are the solutions to this problem. Of course, we have to realize like I said, we have to understand the problem first to get into the solutions. But I think we're at the time with a lot of these problems where we really need to focus on the solutions that are out there. And that's really what conservation biology is, right? It's focusing on trying to, part of it at least, reversing the loss of biodiversity, but restoration ecology, a part of that really looking at restoring landscapes, really trying to attack the habitat loss component that drives biodiversity loss and restore some of these landscapes. And there are great stories out there, right? When we do focus and we get motivated and looking for solutions and finding solutions, we have some success with it. And we've seen some species come back, like bald eagles is a great example of that. And we see that in Nebraska, lots of breeding pairs now where, 40 years ago, we didn't have that. And so we can do the same thing with these bat populations as we understand more about this. And so one thing for your group, Conservation Nebraska, one thing I wanted to show you, this site's pretty neat. Maybe I can jump to it without messing things up, but it's called Conservation Evidence, and it looks at certain problems in conservation biology. And so I searched specifically for bats, and then it compiles all the studies that focus on that potential solution and determine if it's effective or not. And you can access these papers from this site, and it gives you a little summary of them. So things like, if you look here, automatically reducing turbine blades when bat activity is high, they've looked at 2 studies, and it's likely to be beneficial. So it's a nice little site that compiles all this research so you can look at potential solutions and whether or not they're working. Oh, shoot, I messed it up. Sorry.
You're okay.
I jumped. Is it on Zoom?
Just go right there.
Oh, go right there. Oh, good. Thanks. Are we back?
I think you're still sharing.
Okay.
Yep.
So solutions, one of the things we just mentioned about, one of the things, and they started to really do some work on this with wind turbines and these wind farms, and they realized there are some really effective solutions. And one of them is just operational minimization, they call it, really looking at feathering the blades or raising the wind speed that they call the cut-in speed of when those blades start turning, right? Bats often don't fly on really windy nights when those turbine blades are really kicking. If there's a night we know bats are coming through, they can cause those blades, turn them with the wind so they don't rotate, or raise that cut-in speed so they don't start rotating. And the studies have shown that's really effective at lowering mortality of bats. Some of the other things they've looked at are lights or acoustic deterrents, things like that. Those don't have as much evidence as of yet that they're as effective as changing when those blades are rotating. But you know, if we continue to do some research and find some other solutions, that could be helpful as well. But with the problem of wind turbines, we need to know a lot about the bats, right? And so this just diagrams like a life cycle of a bat. And I just wanted to show you, thinking about if we know bats where they are in summer, we know where they're going in winter, we know they're moving, either migratory species or species that hibernate but have to move from their summer roost sites to their winter roost sites. If we know when that's happening, these migration time periods, that's when it can be really effective to tell, you know, wind companies like, okay, this is when the bats are going to be moving through. This is when we need to think about doing these things like minimization to try and reduce that mortality. And because it's at a cost to the wind companies, right? If they stop rotating, they're not generating electricity and making money on that. So if we can really effectively know when bats are migrating through, we can be more effective with when to give advice on how to reduce those. And Glenn knows about this, and you can correct this map for me, Glenn. This was a project that's just getting started here to look at the Missouri River corridor as a migratory pathway for both birds and bats. But part of this is going to look at bats, mainly our migratory species. And these sites are areas that are planned for MODIS towers, and this might have changed a little bit, that can detect bats that are wearing specific tags on them. So this is not that exact. I'll show you a couple pictures to show you what I mean. But the idea is we will first, I think, we'll use acoustic detectors, as I showed you before, to kind of pinpoint where bats are. And so we can use those, we can put those out quickly, and we can see when we're getting high activity of the species we're interested in. And then we can follow up with mist netting, putting up these nets over places where bats like to either forage or fly through, over water, or over here. This is it, where we caught some bats at Offutt Air Force Base foraging at the edge of these trees in a park. And when we catch these bats, this is a big brown bat we caught at one site. Here's an eastern red bat. This is a radio tag. We use slightly different tags for the MODIS project, but we can glue these with surgical glue onto the back of bats and then let them go. And we can, if they happen to fly by one of those towers, it'll register that a bat flew by. So we can get more of a sense of when their migratory timing in the Missouri River corridor, when these bats are flying by, and if they're staying in an area for a long time, or is their migratory pattern just continually moving through. We don't know a lot about migration of bats. We know they do tend to move in groups, kind of swarm together like birds do, or flock together. And they're moving at night, but the timing, we don't have a lot of information on, or whether they're doing stopovers like some birds do, whether they'll stop at a site for a day, a week, and forage and then move on, or whether they're just flying right through the area. So hopefully through this project over the next several years, we'll get a better idea of where these bats are going. Hoary bats, eastern red bats, silver-haired bats, these species that are impacted by wind turbines, but also other species as well. Oh, there's a student that's looking for a red bat. And then I wanted to mention something on the white nose syndrome side of things, that there's been a lot of focus recently on treatments for this disease, trying to stop the spread of the fungus. And one thing to think about is they talk about this triangle of disease, or you've got one part of this is a susceptible host, right? The bat, one part is the pathogen itself, and one part is the environment. If you can change any of those things, you might be able to reduce the severity of the disease and the decline of the population. So if we can make the host less susceptible, so they're doing research into vaccines, boosting the immune system of bats. If we can change the pathogen in some way, or if you can change the environment that the pathogen grows in. That fungus likes cold, moist, dark places to grow. And so there are lots of potential ways they're looking at this. One way to give you a couple examples, they're working on a vaccine right now. They're also working on some probiotics. Like there's a bacteria that's known that has antifungal properties, that secretes some toxins or a substance that's toxic to the fungus. And they've actually tested bats with that. So they spray it on the bat and see if that helps them survive. And it's had some success in both lab trials and then also in field situations. Another thing they've thought about is that maybe we can make the host less susceptible. And there's the fat bat program, they call it, where bats that go in that have more fat can deal with more arousals during winter and maybe make it through that winter with the disease. So they've placed lights outside of some hibernacula to attract insects before bats are going in, so they can feed more and go in with more fat. So they're working on a number of these things to try and help reduce the severity of the disease. One thing, and I'll kind of end with this here, is that I don't know if you paid attention to this. We were so focused on the northern long-eared bat and where this was becoming positive in these sites we were testing. But in this little Greeley County Happy Jack chalk mine here, 10 years of going there and testing for the fungus, it's never been there. And we just kept thinking, well, maybe it's just never made it there, right? Maybe this is a spot it's skipped. It's, now it's made it to California and Washington State and Oregon, and it's still not in this little chalk mine. And here's Eric Fowler took this picture too of a little tricolored bat roosting in this chalk mine. It's only this one species that typically uses it, although occasionally we see big brown bats in there. And this is common for them to get lots of condensation on them while they're hibernating. And so this is a bat that's in torpor. It's hibernating in the little chalk mine. But when we kind of realized, wait a sec, it could be that it's never gotten there, but maybe this mine has some sort of antifungal properties or something. Maybe the fungus doesn't do well in there. So we've started to look at it. I have a colleague here at UNO who's a microbial ecologist, and we got some substrate samples from this mine, and he's looking at what bacteria and fungi are growing in there. And one thing that's interesting about this, we call it a chalk mine, but this is actually diatomite. So it's all these little diatoms from the ancient sea that used to be here, and there's a lot of silica in there. And so diatomite can be used to try and control certain pests like insects. It has some antifungal properties, they think. So maybe there's something to this, and we haven't. So we're just starting to look at that right now, but it's possible that this has some sort of property where the fungus doesn't grow well in there and it can't spread. I think with that, I'll end and take any questions if there are some. I want some huge applause there, Glenn, for this from there.
That map was 90% accurate.
Yeah.
But that was trying to change by 10 minutes. Are you afraid of spreading the fungus when you go location to location, period on your body?
Yeah, absolutely we are. And in that early on, that was both for researchers and also tourist caves. they started to think about that and shut down, have moratoriums on caves, shut them down. Researchers, we have this protocol where we go through and clean things, or we just have dedicated equipment. So we have equipment here that we only use in Happy Jack. Since we have other positive sites like this, these over here, we would have dedicated equipment where we go to this site. But I think that shows this is still a tourist site and people go in and out of there. And we've been testing it for 10 years and the fungus has never popped up there. And so maybe that goes to is even a further line of evidence that says, we've had people going in and out of there. It's surprising that the fungus hasn't shown up there yet. But yeah, we're really concerned about that. And we make sure and decontaminate everything. And the fungus, you just need hot water to kill it. So we can wash things in pretty hot water and kill the fungus, or we can use bleach or things like that as well. And we do those things to keep our equipment clean. But yeah, that's a good point. We need to be aware of that.
You know how it's spread by
Spores, yeah. And that I didn't talk about that much, but that's likely. So yeah, when they found it in New York and figured out what it was and determined it was the cause of the mortality in bats, they sequenced the genome and it was a new species, right? It had never been described. PD is the Pseudogymnoascus destructans is the fungus. But since then, they found it in Europe and Asia. And so the thinking is it's been there a lot longer. We don't see the mortality in bats in Europe and Asia that you do here. So the thinking was, you mentioned the spores, that someone was in a cave, maybe in Europe, got spores on them, and then inadvertently went into a cave in North America, and there you go, and spread it that way. Because we don't see bats doing, hoary bats will migrate, other bats will migrate too, but you don't see bats doing transatlantic migrations. And so it's likely wasn't a bat that did that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. There are open. Yeah.
No open questions.
No
We
open
solved it all.
Yeah. Super interesting presentation though.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah,
And
I mean, enjoy it as much as you
I
can. Not like
I
a
know.
disease and
It's
stuff.
it's negative,
But
right?
yeah.
But but it is true. There are lots of solutions out there, and they're working towards those. And I think it'll have an impact as soon as we're able to implement some of these things. And we're also seeing natural resistance in areas like we saw on the map where you don't see the fungus as much. And so southern states, it's kind of a balance because the fungus grows faster. It needs cool, dark places like caves, but it grows a little faster in warmer caves than it does in colder caves. But yet bats in the south don't need to hibernate as long, or sometimes not at all, and they can leave and get water and food in the winter. So bats in the south might be surviving better, might have some reservoirs of populations that survive down there better. Yeah. So yeah.
That's one great thing. In order for an airfoil to work, you have to have a lower pressure above. So as that's moving along, moving into lower pressure. That's what keeps an airplane up in the air. So there is
that change. And they've seen that. It looks like damage to the lungs that might be consistent with that pressure change. Yeah. And maybe there's an interaction between the two. The bat gets caught in there and has that impact, and then also hits the blades. Yeah, right. I know, right? I mean, there's no, these definitely have a lot, wind turbines have a lot of advantages, right? In terms of generating that renewable energy. And if we can find these solutions, so we really reduce mortality. They really are. I tell students too that if you want to get into the biological world, if you're interested and you want to describe new species, fungus is not, become an expert on fungi, because we know so little about that group as a whole, and all the different diversity within that group.
Still on there. That's what public radio had. Maybe gentleman doing research rather large, you know, like stuff. And stuff like square. And your son.
That's good.
Yeah.
Scorpions, yeah. Well, good. Well, yeah, time to
Yeah,
face the cold, I guess.
yeah. Well, thank you for
Yeah,
presenting. It was
yeah.
super interesting.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's always fun to talk about it.
I've seen the bats in